2.4, Roles and Powers of the President. So overall, the Constitution uses pretty broad language for the president's job description. And the president uses informal and formal powers to get through his policy agenda. And the policy agenda are the issues that are important to policymakers. It's kind of like a to-do list, but like on a bigger, wider scale and stance. To be quite honest, the presidency is iconic. President's very influential, it's very like American, it's this powerful job to hold. Now, we know back when the Constitution was getting written, people were scared of having another monarchy or like dictatorship, and they were a little scared about this president idea. But obviously, eventually they settled on it, and Article 2 explains this. So, the president is required to be a natural-born citizen, 35 years old, a U.S. resident for at least 14 years. They also have the job to be commander-in-chief. They have the power to pardon. They appoint ambassadors, judges, and other public ministers. They recommend legislative measures to Congress, veto or approve bills, convene and adjourn Congress. They are elected through the Electoral College. We'll get into that process a little later. And they have a 4-year term. And these things found in Article 2 are part of the president's formal powers. This is different than those informal powers I talked about that are more like assumed or inherent as part of the presidency. Now, the president cannot introduce legislation, but they're like the face of America, the sort of de facto head of the party. Basically, they're the most identifiable or influential of their party. And I just talked about those formal and informal powers. They are also the chief legislator, so the president can recommend Congress to like do things. They can be like, hey, you should do this. So like the president can ask Congress to make laws concerning certain things. Although a president with like a very strong vision can carry out that easier than like the entirety of Congress, because that's like one person, although they are limited on what they can do. Obviously, like they can't write the laws, that has to be Congress. And then you have the powers of persuasion. So a president can use bargaining and persuasion to have Congress carry out their policy agenda. I was talking about how like, they can be like, hey, Congress, you can make this law. A more persuasive president, that means that Congress is more likely to listen to what they have to say. For example, the book points out Trump and how Trump got tax cuts by using his salesman skills. The power of the veto. Now, the president can veto, basically saying no to a bill, and they can threaten to veto as well. Basically, I don't like this clause. I don't think I'm going to say yes because of that clause, and then maybe Congress will take out that clause, and then maybe the president won't veto it. So they can kind of like threaten a veto to get the bill agreeable to them. And when there's a divided government, there's going to be many more vetoes, because if Congress is one party and the president is the other and their ideals don't match, they're not going to like what each other are doing. So there's going to be more vetoes because they don't like it. And then a pocket veto is where you don't sign yes or sign like a veto during the last 10 days of Congress, so the bill just dies out and it doesn't become law. Because at that point, the congressional session would have ended. And then vetoes can be overridden by 2/3 of a Congress vote. There's been some discussion over line item vetoes. This is basically saying, I will sign this part of the bill, but I'm going to veto these other parts. Say no. The president wants it because that means they have more power over what's going into law. During 1996, Congress granted this power so that the president could line item vetoes on things relating to like appropriations and like money stuff. So when Clinton was in office, he cut some earmarks for New York City stuff, but then New York City got mad, and then Clinton v. City of New York, that struck down this line item veto thing. So there is no more line item veto. You have to say yes to the whole bill or no to the whole bill. Now, the president is also the commander-in-chief. So they have lots of military control, but they cannot declare war. That's reserved for Congress. But they can act very quickly for like defensive acts, which Congress cannot do. And there has been a lot of stretching on the definition of like defense and if like these orders were defensive. But then when the Cold War happened, that expanded the president's power as commander-in-chief. President is also the chief diplomat. So, as long as the Senate approves the treaties, through treaties, the president can facilitate trade, mutual defense agreements, set international environmental standards, and prevent weapons testing. Now, an executive agreement is similar to a treaty, but it doesn't need Senate approval. It's just like a contract, but it depends on each side's like willingness to cooperate. So it was used for the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the president can use these. So the president would likely need like the cooperation of Congress and stuff to follow through on like their side of this executive agreement, but technically Senate doesn't have to approve it. So executive powers and policy with the Panama Canal. So Theodore Roosevelt's whole thing was speak softly and carry a big stick. That was his stance on foreign policy. Basically, we wanted a Panama Canal. So there was this like canal area, and that was controlled by Colombia. And Panamanians had been wanting independence from Colombia. And so Roosevelt was really trying to persuade Congress that this was important and we had to like get a hold on the Panama Canal. So if the Americas supported Panama's like fight for independence, then America could make a canal, was kind of the deal that they struck. So the canal zone ended up being the US's. And they helped by sending this boat, the USS Nashville, basically to support the rebelling Panamanians. And some people were like, that's kind of like piracy, but he was like, it would have taken too long the other way, and I don't know. Roosevelt said, if I had followed traditional conservative methods, I should have submitted a dignified state paper of probably 200 pages to Congress, and the debate would have been going on yet. But I took the canal zone and let Congress debate, and while the debate goes on, the canal does also. But that's an example of how the president can use his executive powers, even if the Congress might not be totally supportive. Now, Panama wanted their flag in the canal zone, and there were some, fights and skirmishes. And then when Jimmy Carter was president, he thought that the return of the canal zone to Panama was very important. And he had this whole emphasis on the morality of the issue. His goal was to erase the imperial past and respect self-governance. So he had to get very, personally involved in discussions to win over Congress support. But now, the U.S. has military control over the area, but Panama does have full sovereignty. Now, the president as the chief executive and administrator. So how the president decides to enforce a law shapes policy agenda. And executive orders, signing statements, running the executive branch, etc., shows how the president acts as a chief executive. Now, executive orders. That is how the president decides to carry out a law. Or rather, allows the president to carry out the law. It's an order. Executive order coming from the president. And it has the effect of a law. So the president can define how military and departments operate, and they can do a bunch of stuff through executive orders. For example, the FDR executive order resulted in the internment camps during World War II of Japanese Americans. Harry Truman then used an executive order to direct the military to racially integrate. Trump had an executive order on immigration policy to limit travelers entering the U.S. from 6 Muslim-majority population countries. And now the orders cannot address exclusive congressional jurisdiction. Basically, the president cannot order something that is within Congress's realm of control. That's just for Congress. But that's some examples of how executive orders have been used. And now signing statements are these little notes that explains the president's understanding of a bill, and it's this is my commentary on this bill. Critics say it overly enhances the president's last-minute input on a bill. This is how I understand the bill, this is what I'm going to do with the bill. And finally, executive privilege is the right to withhold information from another branch. Now, Nixon tested this out during Watergate and in U.S. v. Nixon, the court case, when they were trying to get these tapes from Nixon. He was like, no, this is protected underneath executive privilege. I'm not going to give these to you guys. And so the court was like, yes, executive privilege itself is constitutional and sometimes necessary, but we do need those tapes because those aren't protected by executive privilege. Because in this case, they are evidence in criminal investigation. Thank you for watching. I hope that helped.